All right, looks like we're good to go. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me this month. My name's Alvin Ashcraft, and this month's topic is about choosing the best UI framework when you're starting a new Windows app. There's a ton of options out there. There's been different releases over the years. Microsoft is always saying it's the latest and greatest. This is the next big thing that you should use to build everything. But tonight we're going to go through all the options, talk about some pros and cons, and most of the options we're talking about are from Microsoft. We'll have a couple of third-party things that we'll look at toward the end. Let's start off with a little bit about me. I was a software developer and architect for 25 plus years, working with .NET, C#, WPF, a little bit of Angular, and database stuff was mostly SQL Server on project I've worked on. Some of you may be familiar with my blog, alvinashcraft.com. I have daily link posts every day for .NET developers, different resources that I go through and post on my blog every morning. I've written 3 books now, 2 editions of Learn WinUI 3. The first edition came out when it was still kind of at the end of the preview stages, so I went back into the second edition to clean things up and update things for the release that was out there last year. And I also have a parallel programming and concurrency book for .NET. I joined Microsoft almost 2 years ago now, March of 2022. I'm a content developer, which means I build content on the Learn website, learn.microsoft.com. I work on training modules, documentation, code samples, all those types of things. And it's on the Windows developer documentation. So Win32, UWP, Windows App SDK, and WinUI are the primary things that we work on there. And I'm also an organizer of the TechBash Developer Conference. And we have that conference every fall. Click to the next slide. There's more info here in the Poconos. So we've got great speakers every year. It's usually about 40, 50 speakers that come in. We get some good keynoters. Last year we had Scott Hunter come in to do keynote and Mads Christensen from the Visual Studio team. So the next one's coming up this September, and we have our call for speakers open right now. If any of you out there are speakers or aspiring speakers, you can go to sessionize.com/techbash-2024 and submit some sessions for that. Okay, let's take a look at tonight's agenda. We're going to start with an overview of a little bit of history of Windows development since the introduction of .NET in the early 2000s. And we'll look at some reasons why you may or may not decide to choose each of the UI frameworks that are out there, and followed by a look at some code for each of them. We'll have a solution that's got a project of each type that implements basically the same kind of app using a shopping list app with some sample data hard-coded, just to give you an idea of how things look, how the UI looks with the different frameworks, how the code looks. And we'll see some similarities and differences that you'll see. Not the best UI designer, so you'll see pretty much what kind of styling you get out of the box with each of these. And then we'll finish up with a few guidelines you can use when selecting a framework. And we'll go through some resources that you can keep handy, and maybe hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to ask questions as we go along. It's usually best to answer questions when we're in that context. And if there's anything I don't see popping up in the chat, feel free to just hop in and interrupt. So this is the timeline for when things came out back in 2002. When .NET first released, Windows Forms, WinForms was there right away. That was the successor to VB6 Forms. Back in 1991, Bill Gates had a demo of Visual Basic Form Designer. I'll have all these slides and all the links available to you at the end. I'll pop a link in the chat where you can get all that. But then the next thing that came out, 2006, Windows Presentation Foundation and WPF, that was introduced around the same time as Windows Vista. And it was the first XAML-based UI framework from Microsoft. And shortly after that, short-lived, well, semi-short-lived Silverlight framework came out, originally called WPF-E, and WPF, I think, quickly overtook WinForms as a favorite UI framework for enterprise developers, and it's really become the de facto choice for building desktop line of business apps. We'll just skim over the Windows 8 stuff that happened in 2012. We had those full screen Windows 8 XAML apps. And then when Windows 10 came, that kind of evolved into the Universal Windows Platform, or UWP. So they were introduced with Windows 10, and it gave developers a way to target not just Windows on desktops, but also Windows Phone at the time, and HoloLens, and Xbox with a single project. And they had some success with ISVs building consumer apps, but they never really found a place in the enterprise. There were some constraints that kept folks from wanting to adopt that for more complex apps. And let's see, oops, sorry. Didn't need to scroll up yet. There we go. Next was 2021. We had a couple of things come out. Early that year, there was WinUI 3 and the Windows App SDK. And then later that year, we had Blazor Hybrid Apps came out with that .NET release in the fall. And so we'll talk about each of those a little bit. If we have time, we'll go into a Blazor hybrid solution. And also talk about some newer options. .NET MAUI, that's the successor to Xamarin Forms. That came out in 2022. And it allows you to use XAML and C# to build apps for Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android, and even Samsung watches and TVs. And then we'll touch on some of the third-party options that give you some cross-platform abilities. There's Uno Platform and Avalonia UI, and they pretty much give you all the same targets as .NET MAUI, but they also can go to Linux. And the difference between the two really is there's some licensing differences, but the XAML for Avalonia is like the WPF flavor of XAML, and with Uno, it's more the UWP WinUI XAML. All right, so let's take a look at some UI examples and differences between the frameworks. Now, the upper left screenshot is probably what most people think of when they hear Windows Forms. It looks pretty utilitarian, looks a lot like Windows XP. I've probably created some UIs similar to this even back in BB in the 90s. But the UI right below it in the bottom left, that's also WinForms, and that's got some third-party controls and themes applied. This particular screenshot was taken from a DevExpress example with some of their controls and their theming abilities. And so there's a lot you can do with today's modern .NET Windows Forms. The screen in the middle probably looks familiar to a lot of people. That's Visual Studio 2022 screenshot that I took. And that screenshot has a preview enabled to show the new extension manager, which up until now has been a modal dialog that looks more like WinForms, but they've recently updated it to just be a tab in the UI. And nearly all of Visual Studio's UI today is WPF. There are a few remaining legacy dialogues, like the old extension manager, the options dialog is still WinForms, but it's mostly WPF now. Below that in the center, those are some .NET MAUI screens. Microsoft created a weather app that's responsive to different desktop and mobile form factors, all built with .NET MAUI. And you can get the source code for this app on GitHub. If you just search for .NET MAUI weather sample app, it'll pop up and you'll see the GitHub repo for that. And the top right there, that's another one that might look familiar to folks. That's the Windows File Explorer. And the current File Explorer, the latest one in Windows 11, that was built with WinUI and Windows App SDK. Microsoft then some of their key partners like Apple and Adobe have been using WinUI 3 to create some desktop apps in the last year or so. A couple other examples. Below it, there's an Apple Music app that's available in the Microsoft Store now. That was built with WinUI 3. And Apple also has a devices app where you can connect your phone and do backups and stuff. That just came out. That's with WinUI 3 and an Apple TV app. And Adobe's WinUI app is called Fresco. So let's talk about some Windows Forms advantages first. So the biggest advantage that people like about WinForms, I think, is the rapid UI development you can do with it. It's got the drag and drop designer that people have been using for years to mock up forms quickly. It's got data binding, so you can get things built pretty fast. It's got strong third-party control support, like we saw in the last slide with the Dev Express controls. There's a lot you can do with all the third parties out there in WinForms. There are two options for creating a new WinForms project today. Most people will want to create a modern .NET option with .NET 8 today, but you still have the option to create a WinForms project with .NET Framework. So if you need to target some unsupported Windows 7 machines, that's still an option with .NET Framework. You can start a new project today and still target them. If you have an existing .NET Framework WinForms app, there's also the .NET Upgrade tool that you can use to move that to the .NET 8 version of WinForms. And that tool is also able to upgrade legacy WPF apps to .NET 8. It can migrate Xamarin Forms apps to .NET MAUI or UWP apps to WinUI 3. So Windows Forms is still actively developed and supported. You can visit this GitHub URL and see the current roadmap that was just updated. And I think in the past few weeks, they've updated that for 2024 to talk about what's going to be coming up later this year. And the best thing about WinForms is that every C# developer is already a WinForms developer. There's no separate UI language to learn. That's all in C#. A few of the downsides, like we saw on the previous tab, if you're not using any third-party controls or anything, it does look a bit dated. It looks kind of like Windows XP. There's no GPU acceleration for the UI, like with the XAML frameworks. The GPU can be rendering the UI for you, gives you a little bit better UI performance. There's no C++ support. It's just C# and VB only. And as of now, there's no built-in support for Windows themes. You don't get dark mode out of the box. There's some third-party theming options, but it's not going to automatically switch the UI for you when the user is switching their theme on Windows. And also, it's not great for touch and pen input. There's some things you can do, but it's the controls, they're not built for fingers. So before we move on to the next slide, let's jump over to Visual Studio and take a look at the WinForms app. So I've got a solution with all the different types of projects in here. The WinForms one. Got my shopping list UI that will be loading up. So here you can see it's got drop-down control, text box, and a grid where you can add and manage your shopping list items. It's using a data binding source to bind to my hard-coded data. And for the data with all of these projects, I'm using a shared library. So I've got this helper class that just creates a bunch of categories and items that get bound and loaded to the UI. Let's just run that and see what it looks like. So it looks pretty Windows XP. It's maybe slightly more modern than that, but it doesn't look like some of the other frameworks do. add an item here. I've got buttons over here where I can delete items. I can mark things as purchased. And all of that didn't require a whole lot of code. It was creating the UI was all drag and drop. Got a little bit of code to add, clear the entry field after I add an item, and then to remove one. And when working with WinForms, you can go to the properties. You can easily change all your properties. You can drag the controls around to move things. Easy to work with, but not the prettiest solution unless you get some third-party controls involved. Let's move along to the next one. WPF is next. So WPF apps were the first XAML-based UI from Microsoft. If you're not familiar with XAML, it's a schema-bound XML markup language with support for data binding styles. It can load static and dynamic resources in the XAML markup. Visual Studio provides a UI designer for WPF, as well as XAML hot reload, where if you're debugging, you can make some simple changes while you're debugging in the XAML, and when you save it, it automatically reloads the UI without having to stop debugging and restart. It also has tools to debug data binding errors for analyzing the WPF visual tree. The visual tree is your hierarchy of controls and elements in UI, so you can see how the UI is constructed in a tree format. As I previously mentioned, the XAML-based UIs, they use GPU for rendering. It's being rendered in the DirectX pipeline. Data binding in WPF, it's extremely powerful, and it lends itself to using the model view vmodel or MVVM pattern. If you catch my session here next month, we'll spend some more time looking at MVVM with WinUI 3, and we'll go through a sample app where we implement that using the MVVM toolkit, which is open source from Microsoft. Like WinForms, WPF has .NET and .NET Framework project options, so you can target older operating systems if you need to with .NET Framework. It's got extensive third-party support for different controls. It's under active development, and if you check out that link, you can see the roadmap, and that roadmap, I think, was just updated in the past week. They've got Windows 11 theming support on the roadmap for this year, so you'll be able to pick up light mode, dark mode things automatically, and they're also giving it a whole UI refresh to look a lot more like Windows 11 out of the box. So with all this support they're starting to throw at WPF, they're really trying to position it as the top choice to build your native enterprise apps for Windows. So complex line of business apps, they like to have people pick up WPF for those. So the drawbacks. The biggest one for folks would be the XAML learning curve. Not everybody is crazy about XAML. I love developing in XAML, but it's not for everybody. Like WinForms, it's C# and VB only. There's no C++ support. The Windows theming and dark mode switching, it's still on the way. It's not there yet. The current UI doesn't look like Windows 10 or 11 out of the box yet, but it'll get there this year too. And we'll see once they come out with that UI refresh how much of the Windows 11 fluent design they give it. It is better for touch and pen input than WinForms, but it still wasn't really built with touch in mind quite as much as UWP and WinUI were. And performance-wise, it's much better when you use .NET 8, but there are some improvements in the rendering pipeline that make UWP and WinUI a little bit smoother than WPF. So let's take a look at the WPF project in Visual Studio. So here the main window is XAML file, and then you've got this code behind, which is C#. So let's scroll this. There it comes. Zoom that in a little bit. So WPF and the XAML does give you a preview. So as you're building your XAML, you can see what it looks like here, or you can actually click and drag these things around. I tend to not try to build or move things up in the designer because it doesn't really generate the most responsive XAML for you. Things tend to not resize as nicely with the UI if you build it with the designer. But it is something better for beginners to see how things are built. When they drag things in, they can see how the XAML is generated. So in this one, it's basically the same thing. I have a drop-down text box button and a grid here. Grid is a data grid. And I've got some columns. It's using a data grid columns. It's got some templated columns to create the delete button. And in the code behind, it's pretty similar logic to what we're doing in the WinForms. So it's using the same shared project to get the items and the categories, set those on the collection view source, which is what's used to bind to the data grid. And then we've got an add button that adds an item to the collection and a delete button that removes it. So let's set this as our startup project and run that. Here things look slightly more modern than the WinForms. Functionality is all the same. Delete items, I can check the boxes. Oop, there we go. So we get a similar result, but it's got the XAML UI, and it's easier to apply some styles. WPF and all the XAML languages have a pretty powerful styling framework where you can create a style block and apply it to multiple controls without having to set the properties on each individual control. And that's something else that I'll show next month in the WinUI demos. Let's switch back and move along to UWP. So UWP, thanks to Windows Phone, UWP apps are really optimized for performance. They're small, they're memory optimized with using the .NET native runtime rather than the standard .NET runtime. So the latest WhatsApp app, I don't know if anybody uses WhatsApp, but if you do, there's a Windows app that came out in the past year. I think it was just before Build last year that they released their update that runs on UWP. And it's got great performance. They're very happy with it. I think they'll be moving ahead to WinUI at some point, but right now they're glad to be onto UWP and seeing the performance gains that they got from going from their web-based app. It technically supports HoloLens and Xbox, but HoloLens has been recently deprecated, and I haven't heard a whole lot of folks pushing UWP developers to build new Xbox apps, so I'm not sure where that's going to be going. Visual Studio has a XAML designer for drag and drop UI with UWP, just like it does for WPF. These apps were built for pen and touch. They came out, the previous XAML language that UWP is based on came out with Windows 8, which was heavy on the Surface tablets, and Windows 10 and 11 still, they pushed the touch with Surface. So all these apps built with UWP and WinUI, they're really great with pen and touch input. Like all XAML languages, you can do the data binding with MVVM. And there's a set of WinUI 2 libraries that are open source, and you can add those into UWP project to get some of the some additional controls. You can get some Fluent design support, so they'll look a little bit more like Windows 10 and 11, the Fluent styles. And something that some people like in the consumer apps is that UWP apps are sandbox, which means they have limited access to things like the file system and other Windows resources, so they can be more secure and can prevent bad actors from accessing data from other apps or other parts of your system. Some of the drawbacks, WP, the biggest one is that it's getting no more feature updates. It's in maintenance mode now. It's only going to be getting bug fixes and security updates. And that also goes for the WinUI 2 libraries. There will be no new features added to those. They're just getting critical bug fixes and security updates as well. So .NET Native, while it does give you great performance and the smaller size for your apps, with UWP, you don't get any access to modern .NET or language features. In fact, you can only use C# language features up to, I think, yeah, nothing in C# 8 or later. It's only C# 7 up to that you get with the UWP apps. And while WinUI 2 does have some Fluent design look and feel, it's there's a Fluent 1.0 and Fluent 2.0. And the Fluent 1.0 is more like the Windows 10 look and feel. 2.0 is the Windows 11 look. And so you get the Windows 10 look and feel with the WinUI 2 controls. And so UWP relies on .NET Standard for shared libraries. So like NuGet packages that are out there that you can install in UWP and other types of .NET projects. They need to be, I think, .NET Standard 2.0 to share them across there. And Microsoft is kind of moving away from that .NET Standard because the new .NET 6, 7, and 8, they apply across all different platforms. So they don't really, I don't think they see a reason to keep up with .NET Standard, and they're just moving ahead as .NET being the standard. So that's going to leave UWP projects behind if developers stop releasing libraries that use .NET Standard 2.0 or 2.1. And the other kind of drawback with UWP is that the releases are tied to specific Windows SDK versions. And that means that you have to pick a specific target platform and a minimum platform when you're creating your project. It's a little bit less compatible than you get with some of the other frameworks. So let's take a real quick look at UWP in the project. Now, the one big difference with UWP, because of that difference in the .NET runtime, I couldn't just reference this shared project. It's .NET 8, and I can't reference a .NET 8 project from the UWP project. So what I did was I created a shared folder, and I just have pointers to those files, which is great, except because of that, I have to make sure all the C# in here isn't using any of the newer C# features, like with the latest C#. I could just say new here instead of having to say new category, but that's not going to work with UWP, so I have to leave that type there. So the XAML for this. There we go. You can see it's picked up my my dark mode theme automatically. Let's zoom in a bit here so we can see the controls. Maybe a little bit smaller. So we've got the grid, same kind of controls. The other thing that you get with UWP is in the UI designer, you can pick your framework. So when you were designing for Windows Phone, you could Select a phone here and see what it would render like on a phone. You get desktop, you get Xbox, Surface Hubs, IoT devices. And then the XAML looks pretty similar to WPF, but instead of the data grid, we're using a list view for displaying the list of items. And we have a header template to define the header columns. And then item template defines what each item, what each row is going to look like in the grid. And the code back here is pretty much the same. We have a list of categories. I used an observable collection of items. The observability gives you change notifications if I add or remove items in the UI, or if I add or remove them in here in the code, the UI will get notified. So the UI updates when we do things like removing items here. And let's switch the project and run this. I don't have a splash screen, so that's what that big X was. So here you can see it looks a lot like Windows 10. You get this squared off buttons. Everything's kind of angular looking like Windows Phone and Windows 10 did. Add some frozen corn to the list. Mark things as purchased, delete them just like we could before, and you get a little bit of UI animation with UWP. All right. Next up, let's talk about WinUI 3. So WinUI 3 is the UI component of the Windows App SDK. It supports the latest fluent design concepts, so you get the most modern looking apps out of the box with the least amount of effort, coding, styling on your part. You get features and controls of UWP without being coupled to a specific version of the Windows SDK. The Windows App SDK updates multiple times a year out of band with the Windows SDK and the Windows updates. Some of the recent updates brought XAML Island support, which allows you to host small containers of WinUI inside your other apps. Got some additional theming support came. Notifications APIs were added recently. Improved windowing with an app window object. And media controls were recently added. And in the upcoming 1.5 version, the first preview of that was just released. There's going to be a maps control, which has been missing. UWP has had the maps control all along, but that's coming back now in WinUI. And some additional layout improvements are coming as well. You can check out the roadmap on GitHub, see what's on the horizon there. You get the same rich data binding with MVVM, great for touch and pen, just like UWP. You can upgrade apps from UWP to WinUI with the .NET Upgrade Assistant. You can also get more additional free controls for WinUI with the Windows Community Toolkit and some other libraries with the .NET Community Toolkit. And I'll talk about both of those next month at the meeting in March. And you can also read about those in my book. I go through all that stuff in lots of detail. Finally, Microsoft is really pushing hard to position WinUI as the top choice for ISVs to build apps for Windows. They're really looking for this to be the consumer kind of hero framework. You can see that in the partnerships with Apple and Adobe to bring those high-profile first-class apps to Windows. Some of the drawbacks. So the big barrier for entry with new XAML developers is there's no UI designer like you have with WPF and UWP. It hasn't made the cut yet as far as features. It's been the top request since the release. People really would like to have a designer added. product teams are, I think, well aware of that. And to this point, it just hasn't made it onto the roadmap. I'm hoping that if they do that, they could maybe start by at least giving folks a read-only preview UI so that while you're building in your XAML, you can see what it's going to look like up in the other window. Gives you a little bit better quality of life while you're building your WinUI UIs. Next, there's no Visual Basic, there's no F#. You have C++ with WinUI, and you have C#. If you're porting a UWP app to WinUI, you'll have to leave your Xbox and HoloLens support behind. It's Windows desktop only at this point. And finally, the other big requested feature out on GitHub, if you look through GitHub issues and feature requests, is built-in support for data validation. So like when you type in a control, or if you skip a control that's required, you don't get that automatic turn in control red or whatever when you try to hit submit. The validation is available in a lot of other frameworks. It hasn't made it into WinUI yet. I'm thinking this one is probably going to be there sooner than the designer. They did have it in the original preview releases before the first version of WinUI 3 was released. There's still some code out on GitHub that you can adapt and build it for yourself. And I did that in my book. Showed you how you can add your own data validation pretty easily. So let's take a look at the WinUI project quick. So with WinUI, we were able to reference the shared project, so we didn't have to import those classes. And pull up the UI, and here we don't have any kind of design view at all. We just have the XAML, and it looks almost exactly like the UWP XAML. The main difference between UWP and WinUI XAML and code is really going to be in the namespaces. If we look at, if I hover over here, the stack panel is in the Microsoft.UI.XAML controls framework. So if you look at UWP, the stack panel is in Windows UI XAML controls. So it's the namespaces are almost exactly the same, but you just replace Windows with Microsoft when you get to WinUI. And the code behind is a little bit different because I decided to throw in an MVVM implementation in this project. So you'll see instead of all the code being here, we have a view model, which gets created here in the constructor. And I did leave the delete button, but everything else happens inside the view model class. So in here, we have our categories, we have our items that are going to get data bound to the UI, using some decorators here for on the item name and selected category. These decorators are telling it to notify our add button that the item and category have changed, so it can automatically enable and disable based on whether those are populated. So the add logic does the same thing as the other projects. Can add item is what's evaluated every time those two values are changing up above. So it's checking if your item name is empty or if your selected category is null. That'll either enable or disable the button for us. Let's run that and see that in action. So here you can see the add button is disabled. And as soon as I start typing corn, my button gets enabled, I can add that. And I can check and uncheck just like the rest. I can delete. It's the same kind of little animations that you get with UWP. And it's just like UWP, it's picking up the dark theme from my OS. If I switch to light theme, let's see if we can do that real quick. I pick the light theme, everything will change here. And my app picked that up too. So all that support is just built in. Get that without any extra coding. And let's switch back to our PowerPoint. And .NET MAUI. So if you want to build an app for Windows, but you're also thinking about possibly targeting other platforms, maybe mobile devices, Microsoft cross-platform option is .NET MAUI, and it is the successor to Xamarin Forms. MAUI apps can be deployed to Windows, Android, iOS, macOS, and those Samsung Tizen devices, which are watches and TVs. Linux has been often requested, but they haven't added that support yet. With MAUI, you can create a single code base to target all of those supported platforms, and you can create platform-specific code if you need to access any native functionality. And MAUI also has some common wrappers to wrap some of the device functions, like accessing file systems, cameras, those common things that are different across device implementations. There's wrappers to access those kinds of things. And if you wanted to render anything in your UI differently on different devices, you can create UI platform-specific XAML using the on-platform markup extension. So in your XAML, you would say on-platform iOS. This would be visible, or on-platform Android, do this. If you've built other XAML apps, .NET MAUI is pretty simple to pick up. The XAML and control names vary a little bit, but it's the same concepts as all the other XAML frameworks. It supports MVVM for your separation of concerns and doing your data binding. And you can also, if you don't like XAML, MAUI has the ability to create the UI entirely in C# using C# markup in the .NET Community Toolkit. And when you do this, you can use the MVU pattern, model view update. That's similar to apps built with Flutter. If you've ever done Flutter development, the UI is all built in code, and it's kind of similar to the MVU pattern there as well. And when MAUI apps are compiled and deployed to Windows, it's actually a WinUI 3 under the covers. So anything that's supported in WinUI 3, you can do with your Windows MAUI app. So that means right now you can't have any maps controls, because that's coming in the next version of WinUI. So once that's out, then you can do your MAUI apps with maps on Windows as well. And there's also Blazor Hybrid if you want to build for mobile. We'll look at Blazor Hybrid if we have time on desktop, but what that does is it creates a MAUI mobile shell with a web view control, and then your Blazor web app gets loaded inside that web view. So you can build your Razor views and C# code, and it's all hosted within the MAUI mobile app. So some drawbacks. So if you have a lot of device-specific stuff that you're going to be doing, you can end up having more platform-specific code, so writing more code separately for each different platform. Like WinUI, there's no XAML designer to build your UI. You have to code all the XAML by hand and use the XAML hot reload to see it while you're debugging, maybe make some tweaks while you're debugging. Right now, MAUI is C# only. There's no VB, F# or C++. You can kind of work around that with Blazor Hybrid. If you're an F# developer, you can build your Blazor Hybrid code with F# inside of MAUI. And let's see, more people are using MAUI for iOS and Android than they are for Windows. So that's the priority for the product team right now, is getting MAUI and the Xamarin Forms developers moving to MAUI up and running on iOS and Android as quickly as possible, because the Xamarin support is ending, I think in May. It's sometime this spring that Xamarin support is ending, so they're pushing hard to get everybody upgraded to MAUI, and most of that is iOS and Android. And there is some really good Windows support. They have things like keyboard accelerators and things. Tooltips are all there for Windows apps. Um, but if you find issues on Windows, they're probably not going to be prioritized quite as high as the other devices. If you're a more advanced developer, XAML developer, and you use control templates for really customizing UI, not all the Maui controls support templating. Even the button control, you can't use control templates with that to customize the button. And while .NET 8 and Maui is fast, any kind of abstraction like Maui is never going to be as fast as building native apps. So a native iOS app is always going to be faster than Maui or Flutter, any of those types of frameworks. Let's take a look at that code. All right, so the main page, our Maui page, and there's no designer here, so it's just the XAML. And you can see the controls are named a little differently. The drop-down combo box is called a picker. Text box is entry. List view is still a list view. And in our code behind, it looks pretty similar to the WPF, where we've got all the code right here in the code behind. Categories and items, got an add button and a delete button, and clearing the fields. So let's switch this to Maui. And when you switch to Maui, I have it defaulting to run the Windows app, but you can also select your Android emulators. If you use, I won't demo that here, but if you use the Windows subsystem for Android, it runs Android right inside Windows, kind of like the Windows subsystem for Linux can run Linux on Windows. It's a little bit faster than running an emulator, I think, and it also makes it pretty easy to resize your Windows. So you can run your Android app and resize the window right in Windows. Let's run the native Windows one that's going to be running WinUI. So it's going to look kind of similar to WinUI. I think it might pick up some different colors that are more Maui looking. They're big on the purple. So we'll select our category, do donut again. That was added to the end here. Just like the others, we can select, we can delete. And things resize like you would expect without any extra coding. The XAML is very dynamic like that. So with this single code base, we could debug on iOS. We can go to Android. You can set up Mac OS in there as well. All right, so it looks like we're getting a little bit close on time, but I'll quickly just touch on Uno and Avalonia. So Uno platform is a third-party solution. It gives you the cross-platform options that you get with Maui, but you also get Linux support. And actually, you also get web with Uno platform and Avalonia. They use WebAssembly to be able to deploy your app to browsers. You can do platform-specific implementations for device-specific code, just like Maui. When you target Windows with Uno, you can use SKIA WPF to run on older OSs, but typically you want to select the WinUI and Windows App SDK version to run on Windows 10 and later. The version 19041, that's what WinUI supports out of the box. The WinUI Uno apps look almost identical to native WinUI apps. The code you can actually copy and paste from your WinUI project into an Uno project, and it should run most of the time. The only time you might need to change something is if you have different namespaces. If you named your project differently, you probably have to tweak your namespaces. It does support C# markup, just like Maui does. So if you want, you can create all your UI in C#. They have a Figma plugin. If you have a design department that uses Figma, they can design your UIs there and hand it off to the developers to have your Uno UIs, the XAML created for you automatically. And themes, they support Fluent Design for Windows. They support Google's Material Design and the Apple Cupertino Design. And they have plugins to develop in Visual Studio, VS Code, or even JetBrains Writer, as you know. Drawbacks, no official support for VB or F#. Actually, I don't think they have C++ either. That should be up there. It's a third-party solution, so I know some companies can be a little gun-shy about going with third-party option. So Microsoft partners, they might try to stick with Microsoft solutions. There are paid options for advanced support with some of these third-party. Avalonia also has some licensing terms for app deployment. I think there's a cost for however many different deployed apps you're going to have. There's no XAML designer. There's the platform-specific code option we talked about with Maui. If you have a lot of device-specific things that you're going to be doing. Same kind of performance concerns with the abstractions. So let's take a quick look at I have a separate solution for Uno. So in here, there's a separate project for each of the targets, Windows, WebAssembly, the different mobile projects, and there's a base solution. And then down in here in the main project is where all the shared code lives. So you have just this one page with the UI code. And this was all just copy pasted from the WinUI project, as was the view model. It's all exactly the same. So if we run, here you have you choose mobile, server, WebAssembly, or Windows. We'll run the Windows version. And it looks and behaves just like the WinUI. All right, almost to the end here. I wanted to quickly just touch on Blazor Hybrid. Like I mentioned, you can have Blazor Hybrid hosted in a Maui app, so you can deploy to mobile. You can also do desktop. And on the desktop side, you can host Blazor Hybrid inside either WPF or Windows forms. So with Blazor, if you are a web development shop and you already know Blazor, you know C#, there's no XAML learning curve for you. You can use powerful CSS styling like you do in all your web apps. You've got the .NET compatibility with all the code that's used in Blazor. You can use, like I said, WPF or WinForms to integrate with existing desktop apps as well, too, if you just wanted to have the one screen with the Blazor app inside it. And Maui for mobile. The cons, there's always interop costs, possibly performance when you're running web inside of Windows. Could there be bugs? Not sure. But if there are, you have to worry about support across two products. You've got your Blazor and you've got your desktop with two different sets of product teams you might have to deal with if you run into support issues. And accessibility. I've worked with some web view code before where we were running Angular inside a Xamarin app, and it just feels like web inside there. You know, the web UI is kind of bouncy looking when you're scrolling. Doesn't feel quite like a Windows app. Let's just take a quick look at that laser project. So this is a WPF project. I have a WPF SAML window. It just has a Blazor web view inside of it. And then it's running, you have an index page that gets loaded up, and then the shopping list Blazor is my Blazor app inside there. This is my component that's going to load up inside the web part of it. Let's run that quick just to take a look at my not so great web styling skills. So corn in the frozen section, add that. It should be at the bottom of my list. Delete items. So it works like the others. Doesn't look great because I'm not the best web developer, but you've got your CSS, uses Bootstrap for the styling. And there is a page that I used. It's kind of a manual process to create your WPF Blazor app. You have to go and kind of add some files manually. Once you create the WPF project, you have to add a package, you have to add some of these files yourself. But it does work. So choosing a framework, that's going to be dependent on your team. What programming languages do you know? What do you prefer? What are they good at? Do you have any existing experience with XAML? Do they like XAML? Does it need a drag and drop designer? So .NET support, do you need .NET Framework for older Windows devices? Do you need touch support? Do you need cross-platform options, or do you think you will in the future? Long-term support options, that's a concern with UWP. How long is that going to be around? It's supported for now, but probably won't be forever. And then, what are the current features? Do the current features meet your needs, or are there things on the public roadmap that will meet your needs by the time you have to go to market? Those are some of the bigger concerns to look at when you pick your framework. I've got some resources here, some of the links that I've talked about, and I'll also drop a link in the chat to this is my speaking resources page. So I've got all the if you go into 2024, I've got this meeting in here. So I've got the UNO project and the other one with all the other projects in it. And I've got the PowerPoint is in here, and this links MD has a list of all the links and the slides and a few extras. And then my main page has some other links, has some other upcoming things I'm doing. My books are there. I will drop this link in the chat for folks that are in the meeting. And we can wrap up. If there are any questions, we can go back and look at some things.
Yeah, and we'll share that link you just dropped on the comments in the meetup group as well, so folks can get that who are in the room.
Awesome.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording though.
Okay, sounds great.